Madam President, today the United States is facing perhaps the greatest range of security threats, both here at home and abroad, that we've seen in a long time. Here at home, of course, our southern border has become a major security liability that's being exploited by terrorists, drug traffickers, and, of course, human smugglers. In the Middle East, our close ally, Israel, is defending its right to exist, following a brutal and unprovoked attack by the terrorist group Hamas. In Europe, Ukraine continues to defend itself in the wake of Russia's unprovoked invasion, which was nearly 2 years ago. And in the Indo-Pacific, China's aggressive, belligerent behavior has threatened the stability of the entire region and the future of Taiwan. So there's a lot at stake, and the eyes of the world are firmly on the United States of America. You know, I know sometimes people say, well, we don't want the United States to be the world's policeman, and certainly that's true. But the fact of the matter is that there is no other nation that can actually lead the democracies in the world to a greater path of security and safety. We know that when the United States does not lead, then that's perceived as a sign of weakness and a lack of resolution. And that, I think, has contributed to where we find ourselves today with this tremendous array of diverse threats. So there's a lot at stake, and the eyes of the world are on the United States. Terrorists and dictators, from Kim Jong-un to President Xi in China to Vladimir Putin to the supreme leader in Iran, all of them are watching to see what the United States, how it responds when our friends and our allies become victims of authoritarian aggression. Will we brush these conflicts aside as meaningless regional quarrels, or will we lock arms with our friends and allies and commit to defeating evil in all its forms? I'm glad that the overwhelming consensus in Congress is that the only possible option is to respond with strength. Last week, the House of Representatives passed a bill to strengthen America's support for Israel while cutting wasteful government spending. That legislation provided $14.3 billion in aid to Israel. And I'm disappointed that President Biden, first thing out of the chute, threatened to veto the bill, and Senator Schumer went so far as to call it a joke. $14.3 billion for Israel while it's under perhaps an existential threat by Iran and its proxies, and the majority leader of the United States Senate calls that $14.3 billion a joke. I don't think there's anything funny about the strong desire that most of us have to support our ally while protecting the long-term financial health of our country. The nation's debt has skyrocketed over the last few years and now exceeds $33.6 trillion. The interest on that debt alone will cost American taxpayers more than $677 billion this year alone. Increasingly, we are seeing the amount of money we have to pay to the bondholders that own our debt creep up to approach the amount of spending we provide for the Department of Defense. And we know this is going to get worse and worse until it gets better. Congress simply cannot continue to spend and spend with no regard to the consequences. I know years ago, Admiral Mullen, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said something that at the time I found a little odd. He said, our greatest national security threat is our national debt. But as we've come to see, those are wise words, because as the interest we have to pay to those who own our debt continues to grow with the size of that debt, that means less and less money is available for priorities here at home and for priorities to help prevent wars and aggression around the world. So Nowhere is this more apparent now than with the $677 billion that we're paying, not for some program that we can agree is all important here at home or provide border security or to help arm the Ukrainians in their fight for survival against the Russian invasion. That money is gone to the bondholders, the people who own that debt. And we just cannot continue down that path without further endangering, as Admiral Mullen wisely said years ago, this has created a national security threat that we cannot ignore as well. So we have an obligation to make tough decisions to right the ship. And this is as good an opportunity as any to start making progress. So despite the majority leader's current refusal to allow a vote on the House bill, that's his current position, one I hope will change, the fact remains we do need to take action. The Senate must find a path forward to strengthen our support for Israel and Ukraine while making meaningful steps to address the out-of-control crisis at our southern border. Senate Republicans are discussing ways to do this in a thorough and thoughtful manner, and I expect that to remain a focus of our work for the next couple of weeks. This is an important and long overdue debate, but it cannot distract from our other fundamental responsibilities to support our nation's security. We have other long-standing tasks that need to be completed, starting with the National Defense Authorization Act. That bill passed the Senate in July with an overwhelming bipartisan support by a vote of 86 to 11. This year's defense bill helps replenish our defense stockpiles, something that has been exposed, or inadequacy of our defense industrial base, and our ability to replenish those stockpiles is very much in question and needs to be addressed. This year's National Defense Authorization Act does that. It also supports modernization efforts across the board, from the nuclear triad to next-generation weapons. And it will help us regain a credible military deterrent by investing in modernized aircraft, weapons, and facilities. These were the important goals when the National Defense Authorization Bill passed the Senate 3 months ago, and they're even more critical now. Despite the fact that the Senate and the House each passed a version of the NDAA, as it's called, we've yet to formally begin the conference process where those differences can be worked out and where that bill can be signed into law. This legislation should have reached the President's desk earlier, but we're now a month past the due date and watching a new war unfold in the Middle East. So it's absolutely critical that we get the NDAA conference process moving as soon as possible. As the Senate and the House prepare to iron out the differences between the two bills, there are two items in particular that I've been fighting to include. One is called outbound investment transparency, which was included in the Senate bill but not the House bill. Senator Casey from Pennsylvania and I offered our bipartisan bill as an amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill here in the Senate, and it was adopted by a vote of 91 to 6. The reason this measure receives such strong bipartisan support is because it provides much needed visibility into a looming national security threat. We know that American investors have been sending capital, intellectual property, and some of our cutting-edge innovation to China by investing in that country. But unfortunately, as we've learned, the Chinese Communist Party, which controls that country, basically is using that investment from American investors to fuel its economic and military rise. At the end of 2020, U.S. investments in Chinese companies totaled $2.3 trillion in market value. That includes $21 billion in semiconductors, $54 billion in military companies, and a whopping $221 billion in artificial intelligence. Those are enterprises that are being funded by U.S. investment in China, which is now turning out to be our near-peer competitor and a threat to stability not only in Asia, but worldwide. Intentionally or not, American companies are investing in products and capabilities that one day could be turned against us. A recent investigation by Newsweek uncovered another grave cause for concern. Private U.S. entities aren't the only ones fueling China's rise. Taxpayer-funded research is being exploited by the Chinese Communist Party. The scientist who is now at the forefront of China's artificial intelligence development received at least $100 million in federal grants, U.S. federal government grants through the Pentagon and the National Science Foundation. He received this amount of funding from American taxpayers as he built up a parallel research system in China. The United States, simply stated, cannot continue to bankroll China's economic and military rise. And that's why this outbound investment transparency provision that Senator Casey and I have authored, and which is included in the Senate version of the NDAA, is so important. This legislation requires U.S. companies to notify the Department of Treasury of certain investments in China and other countries of concern. This is a targeted measure. It only applies to sensitive technologies like semiconductors, artificial intelligence, hypersonics, and other capabilities that could ultimately be used against the United States. And to be clear, this does not stop investments from happening or interfere with the free market. It is strictly about transparency. It's about visibility. It will help us as policymakers see and understand the threats from China and other countries of concern so we can respond accordingly. I don't care how much American investors want to build a Burger King or Starbucks in China, but I do care if they are investing in cutting-edge technology that is going to be used to compete against the United States, either economically or militarily. The second provision I'm fighting to include is an extension of something called Lend-Lease authority, which expired at the end of September. This provision was created by legislation I introduced with Senator Cornyn from Maryland, which is modeled after a similarly named program in World War II. But this is called the Ukraine Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act, and it was signed into law in May of last year. It was rooted in the same principle as the World War II provision, which allowed the United States to supply Great Britain and other allies with military resources during World War II. President Roosevelt at the time vowed to transform the United States into the arsenal of democracy, as he called it. And the Lend-Lease Act is how he did it. As I said, Senator Cornyn and I introduced this bipartisan legislation to remove some of the big bureaucratic hurdles that prevent us or slow us down from providing Ukrainian forces with the weapons they need when they need them. Given the level of aid being provided by Congress for Ukraine, the Biden administration hasn't explicitly used that authority granted under that bill, but it doesn't mean it's not needed now. Ukraine is committed to doing what it needs to do to defeat this invasion by Russia, but it will need additional assistance from the United States and our other allies in order to succeed. We all know that Ukraine's arsenal is shrinking, and it's asked the United States and other democracies around the world for additional aid. But the path forward, as we all know, is extremely muddy. There's broad bipartisan support for the fact that America should support Ukraine, but there's growing concern over the cost of that assistance. And that's why this legislation is so important. Lend-Lease is not a blank check. It gives the administration the option to lease or rent defense articles to Ukraine, just like we did Great Britain in World War II. This legislation will allow us to answer Ukraine's call to provide more of what they need and ensure it's done in a fiscally responsible way. Over the last several months, the U.S. has provided Ukraine with unprecedented defense aid, javelins, stingers, grenade launchers, small arms, tanks, ammunition, and much more. These weapons have allowed the brave Ukrainians to punch above their weight against the Russian army, which was once thought to be among the strongest in the world. Additional American and allied assistance is vital to Ukraine's ultimate success, and we need to reauthorize the Lend-Lease authority as part of the Defense Authorization Act. This provision was included also in the House's NDAA, and I urge my colleagues in the Senate to fight for its inclusion in the final version of the bill. Madam President, given the threats democracies are facing around the world, there could not be a more important time to prioritize America's defense. The National Defense Authorization Act, which I believe has been signed into law for 60+ years in a row, should have already been signed into law before the end of September. Given the threats we face around the world, it's absolutely crucial that we finish the job as soon as possible.